Hi, I'm Mia. I'm a counseling center advocate at YWCA Spokane, and today I'd like to share some information with you about the biological impacts of trauma and how you can learn to identify these impacts in the behaviors and physiological symptoms that may manifest in your life and your body. This video is actually part of a series that my colleagues and I are collaborating on. During the time of recording this, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we really want folks to know that though we've transitioned to mostly working from home during this time, we're still here and we still care. We want to continue to have an active presence in the community in both responsive and preventative trauma work. And so as you watch these videos, we really hope that you'll gain more knowledge, explore topics that you may not have been exposed to, and empower yourself and those around you to be in healthier, happier relationships. Now, it's really common to think of the brain and the body as separate. In reality, though, they're intrinsically and irrevocably linked. With my somewhat limited artistic skills, I drew a diagram of the nervous system, which will help illustrate this. So this blue section here, this is your brain. This red section is your brainstem. I've added an outline in purple of the body, and all of our muscle and tissue groups are contained within it. And these little yellow lines represent all of our nerve cells and neural pathways. All of us are covered in nerve cells everywhere, inside and out, and I think this is super cool. We have nerve cells on the tips of our fingertips, along our skin, inside of our intestines, in the connections between our muscle and tissue groups, and in more places than I can name, honestly. And all of these nerve cells function in some way to share information with the brain. The brain, in turn, then mediates all of this information, decides how we feel, both in our body, in our somatic experience, and in our affective state through our emotions, and then this influences our behavior. It's easy for most of us to understand how physical experiences are connected with mental experiences. We're trained to think this way. For example, with a very basic understanding of the nervous system, we can conceptualize how stubbing one's toe sends pain signals to the brain. In fact, this is really common sense to many of us. However, we're not necessarily taught to think about or understand how mental experiences are connected to physical experiences. I could talk at length about the connections between the mind, the body, and the brain. There's a lot of material to cover there, an expansive body of work, you could say. Today, though, I'm going to focus on understanding trauma responses in the context of relationships between the brain and the body. And I really hope that you'll find this information helpful, as I have, in understanding how I myself and those around me respond to stress and trauma, and in promoting holistic healing practices. So outside of the nervous system, there's one other major bodily system that it's helpful to have a basic understanding of for this conversation: the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is also a major messaging system throughout the body, which communicates in the language of hormones. The endocrine system interacts with the nervous system in many ways, including through the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal axis. I always have a really hard time saying that, so I'm lucky that it's also referred to as the HPA axis. When we encounter situations that may be challenging, threatening, or uncontrollable, such as traumatic situations, a cascade of events is activated within the HPA axis, which we recognize as the stress response. So think about what happens when you're upset. Your heart may race, your palms may sweat, you may want to run away, or you may find yourself frozen in place. And maybe you've heard this referred to as the fight or flight response, or more accurately, the fight, flight, or freeze response. These stress reactions, which we recognize within the paradigm of the fight, flight, or freeze response, have developed in an evolutionary timeline to be adaptive and serve us, to help us handle difficult situations in our environments. During periods of prolonged stress, repeated traumas, or repeated experiencing of past traumas, which can happen for individuals who experience PTSD, the stress response loses its adaptive edge, though. Our body is then continuously readying us to conquer a challenge which we may not actually have the capacity or resources needed to overcome, and we may be given no time to rest on an emotional or physiological level. This can have real damage on the body. We know that prolonged stress response, if not treated properly, can manifest in both mental and physical health disorders, including depression, PTSD, immune disorders, chronic fatigue, and metabolic disorders. So seeking treatment or promoting your own healing in whatever way works for you is very important in stressful periods of your life or after traumatic exposure. Let's revisit our friend the brain. I heard an analogy once that compared the brain to Russian nesting dolls. And I love this because it illustrates in a concrete way how the outermost parts of our brain are the most complex, the most detailed, and the newest sections of our brain, while the innermost parts of our brain are generally older, more generic, and simpler in comparison. We can use another visual to further explore this concept. So the brain can be divided into three basic regions: the reptilian brain here in red, the limbic system here in yellow, and the neocortex here in blue. The reptilian brain is the innermost part of our brain and controls our basic functions. In short, it's its job to keep us alive. The limbic system exists in a sort of mid-level state of our brain and can be thought of as a sort of emotional control center. It's responsible for both our fear and pleasure responses. It's important in traumatic experiences. Our neocortex is the outermost part of our brain and is in charge of what we call executive function, meaning the use of logic, imagination, planning, and control. Our neocortex, generally, is primarily in charge of our conscious thoughts and behavior. When affected by stress, fear, or trauma, the neocortex becomes impaired, though. This means that those affected by stress, fear, or trauma may be biologically unable to think rationally, focus attention, or inhibit impulses. During these times, a phenomenon called amygdala hijacking can also occur, in which our amygdala, which lives here in the limbic system and controls fear responses, can take over the neocortex and promote us as people to act out of fear, biologically. So far we've talked about the stress response system, the basic regions of the brain and their primary functions, and how trauma can impact processes throughout the body and the brain. One thing that many people are also curious about is whether trauma impacts memory, and if so, how? So I wanted to touch on that as well. In short, yes, trauma can and does have an effect on memory through multiple facets, including memory formation, storage, and recall. Typically, memories are formed and stored in an organized way, follow a sequential pattern, are easy to recall when desired, and we generally have control over the recall of our memories. However, traumatic memories are characteristically different from typical memories, and this impacts how survivors process their trauma both during and after its occurrence. Generally, traumatic memories are not well organized, are not sequential in nature, and instead they're often fragmented and don't necessarily follow a logical timeline. We also have less control over the recall of our trauma memories. So instead of us choosing when to recall a memory, situational factors may trigger the recall of a memory when the survivor does not want to recall the trauma. Imagine how frustrating and difficult all of this may be. Something challenging happened to you, and even if you normally have an exceptional memory, You may not be able to remember your trauma in the same way you typically can remember other events. Also, even though you may not want to, you could be forced to think about the trauma when you're triggered by numerous situational factors, including smells, similar environments, a certain texture of a chair or a couch, or the particular lighting in a room, among other things. Now, it's not really important to me whether you remember all the details about the systems in our body that we've talked about. And there's way more detail to all of that than I could go into this video anyway. If you do find the details interesting though, I highly suggest you read up on them or watch more videos to learn more on your own. We'll have links provided below. What I really want you to take away from this is the understanding that there are real reasons why trauma survivors act the way they do. Even if it doesn't make sense to you, a behavior that you see is coming from somewhere that's logical and makes sense. I like to think of humans as systems, and when one part of the system is off, even just slightly, this can have a massively impactful cascading effect across the whole system's function. So I hope that this understanding encourages you to have compassion and empathy for the trauma survivors in your life, including yourself, if that's relevant to you. I'm really grateful that you listened to this video, and I hope that you'll continue your journey of learning.